Great. So, hello everyone. My name is Jack, and I'm here along with my fellow group mates of the Dartmouth Sports Analytics Club to present our findings about two high safeties. Uh, so, what are the general trends of two high safeties in the NFL? Such as when are teams using it, where, such as when do they find it most effective, and what are some other interesting trends? So we have found that NFL defenses tend to go too high most frequently on long yardage situations, regardless of whether it's first, second, or third down. This means that in these situations, defenses are most likely trying to prevent offenses from taking deep shots down the field and limiting them to short yardage plays that will fall short of the first down and get the ball back into the hands of their offense. In short yardage situations, defenses are more concerned with preventing first downs by stopping the run, QB sneak, or short passes. So they will bring one or both safeties down, which is why you see in that graph, fourth down um, is a little bit lower, that bar. And defenses employ two high safeties most likely near the end of each half. Sorry, most frequently. When the offense is doing the 2 minute drill. This is once again mostly preventative. A defense is employing two high safeties to lower their likelihood of surrendering a chunk play in a big situation, which would lead to an adverse outcome and maybe even lose them the game. And you could see that the preventative aspect carries through when you look at how the score differential is as well. The defense is often employing more too high looks when they have the lead. And you can see that there's a big jump from when it's tied to then when the defense is up just a slight margin, 1 to 3 points. You actually see a noticeable jump there. And because of that, the data suggests that defenses consistently use too high shells when they are preventing. And you can see that in terms of personnel, they're also varying their looks. So they're using consistently too high shells against 11 personnel, which is a very common pass grouping, and the highest passing personnel rate, which they use too high shells for, is actually occurs against the 1-3-1 set, where you have one running back, three tight ends, and one wide receiver, which is actually a very heavy personnel group, which implies that offenses bring in extra tight ends. Defenses will still use two high safeties, which even on like run heavy looks. So now I'll hand it to John to go over the rest of the trends.
Hello, everyone. Now we're going to look at some actual team data. So this graph examines how often different teams across the league actually use the too high look. And we can see that the Minnesota Vikings use the too high look by far the most at around 45%, and the Browns use it the least at around 20%. So there's a lot of variation between teams across the league. And next, we wanted to look at the actual effectiveness of different teams' usage of the too high look. So, looking at EPA per play allowed, we see that the Bengals are the least effective at using the too high coverage types by a significant margin again. And the Browns are actually the most effective at using it. But this may partially be due to the fact that they use it the least. So opposing offenses aren't necessarily game planning for those looks. They're game planning for the other schemes the Browns use on defense. So we wanted to map usage versus effectiveness to see which teams were using the too high look quite a bit and still remaining effective at it. So we see again the Vikings are using the too high look quite a bit, and they're still remaining very effective at it. And then teams like the Jaguars, Chargers, and Bills, which are to the top right of the Jaguars, are using the too high look above the median usage rate for teams, but they're still remaining very effective at it. And there's also no real correlation between too high usage rate and the effectiveness of that team's usage. So next we look at the EPA per play of quarterbacks versus how often they see the too high look. And again, there's no real correlation. We see that good quarterbacks are good against different coverage types, and bad quarterbacks remain bad against the different coverage types. And then looking at the different coverage types within the too high umbrella, we see that the league has kind of optimized defensive coverage type usage based on how effective they are. So cover four, for example, allows the least EPA per play on average. And as a result, it is used the most, followed by cover two. And then man cover two is by far the least effective. It allows the most average EPA per play, and consequently, it is used by far the least.
So to summarize this section of trends, the too high safeties are mainly a preventative measure, often happening in crunch time situations when defense is in a favorable position, whether that be in yardage or in the actual score of the game. Teams employ too high safety looks with varying degrees of frequency and success, and defenses don't really vary their too high looks based off of the quality of the opposing quarterback. And finally, the NFL has really optimized the cover two and other too high safety looks, meaning that they are using the too high safety looks the most frequently that are the most successful, and they're using less common too high looks when those have less EPA per play. So now let's move to part two.
All right, great. So for part two, we analyze how offense actually responds to these cover two defensive strategies. So yeah, here in our first graph, we graphed average EPA per play on different route types. And you can see the clear winner here is the cross flat, corner flat route with a 0.65 EPA. And that's followed by four verts and four outs, and then vertical post, out hook, out hook. And on the next slide, we have the different completion rates per route types. And here you can see how the four verts has a high EPA, but a low completion rate, where it's kind of a volatile route, a boom or bust play that's used in maybe like end of the quarter, end of the game type situations. And the clear winner, again, sorry, is the cross flat, corner flat route with a 90% completion rate and also a high EPA. Additionally, the four out route also has a high completion rate of 72.7%. One more trend that we analyzed on this graph was how a lot of the routes that were above 60% completion rate were the horizontal stretch routes. So we found that these routes that could stretch the horizontal really targeted the too high coverage the best. So yeah, for our key findings here, the clear best route here was the cross flat, corner flat route that combined a high EPA and a high completion rate. This route really stretched the defense and was able to counter the too high coverage. And the best types here are the spacing-based horizontal routes compared to the vertical structures, which can have high EPAs but have lower completion rates. They're very high risk compared to the more horizontal stretch routes.
So moving into part three, which is about situational game planning, we focus a lot on the Vikings defense. So it's important to understand, how that defense operates and what makes them unique compared to the other defenses in the league. So just reiterating from an earlier slide, the Vikings use the too high shell the most in the league. So we have to specifically game plan around that defensive strategy. So because of this, we analyzed the three different offenses to determine which was the best against the too high look. And for this graph, we examined the average EPA per drop back against the too high look among the three teams. And we saw the Bills were the most effective out of the Patriots and Chiefs. And then we actually just narrowed it down to the best defensive formations found in part two, and we saw the Bills were even more superior compared to the other teams. And then comparing league-wide on the next slide, we see that the Bills this season were the third most effective offense against the two high look, which was the highest ranking out of the three teams we could select from. So we went with the Bills to game plan for.
Yeah, so adding on to what John was saying about the Vikings defense, as you can see on this graph, we examined the Vikings defensive personnel in too high, and the amount of plays that they actually ran. So this graph shows the distribution of that. And as we can see, there are 5 personnel packages that account for almost 85% of their too high defensive snaps, with their 2 D linemen, 4 linebacker, and 5 defensive back combination being the most common. On the next slide, we can also see that the Vikings' too high defensive structure is super effective against spread personnel groupings, but less effective against balanced and heavier offensive formations, with standard 11 personnel generating more offensive efficiency, as you can see with a 2.67 EPA. And that suggests that there is vulnerability in run pass conflict scenarios. The next slide shows the most targeted receiver positions versus the Vikings too high defense, and as well as the percentage of total attempts. So as you can see here, offenses against the Vikings too high disproportionately target outside receivers, and that accounts for over 42% of their attempts. And this indicates that boundary matchups, especially on the outside, are the primary target area, and teams would rather exploit matchups than attacking for, say, the middle of the field, which is very deep and protected. The next slide shows the impact of QB scrambling against the Vikings too high. And as you can see, the impact of QB scrambling is very effective, and it represents a major vulnerability in the Vikings too high defensive scheme. It generates a 0.75 EPA advantage compared to just regular pocket passing, which indicates that coverage heavy alignment sacrifices quarterback containment, and it also creates exploitable rushing lanes for the offense's quarterback to use. On this slide, we looked at formation success on 1st and 10 versus the Vikings too high and the different plays that different offenses ran. So on early downs, offensive formations that maximize horizontal spacing, like slot aligned and spread formations, they generated significantly higher offensive efficiency against the Vikings too high defenses than other formations, which suggests that condensed formations like bunch alignments, such as bunch right, as you can see at the very bottom, those seem to be way more ineffective compared to something like a slot right, which is way more spaced out.
So yeah, this is where we kind of translated a lot of those findings into a specific game plan. If you go to the next slide. So here we're looking at looking at the Bills specifically, what personnel is going to be the most effective, and clearly you can see the 12 personnel with the 1 running back and 2 wide receivers and 2 tight ends is going to be the most effective. From an intuitive perspective, adding the 2 receiving tight ends is going to work really well against the Vikings 4 linebacker package. It's again creating the horizontal spacing that we wanted to create problems for the linebacker coverage. And then the next slide, we look at specific formations. So actually looking at the Bills data specifically, we found that a balanced formation is going to be the optimal formation. It's going to force the defense to defend the entire field and respect the run game. Again, with the horizontal spacing we wanted to use. And because balanced looks are pass neutral, the Vikings aren't going to audible and trigger run adjustments. We also found there's about an 80% completion rate with all balanced formations versus the Vikings. Again, we wanted to avoid bunched and unbalanced formations. Even though things like slot right and slot left are effective, it's more likely to trigger run audibles, so we wanted to avoid those. And then we're looking at route concepts specifically, and we found this is against Vikings 2-4-5 personnel, and we found the vertical stretch with the 4 verts is productive but less efficient. It's going to be more risky, and intermediate spacing concepts are going to be more specific. In terms of the 4 outs and the cross hook out specifically, we think that the 4 outs is going to be more effective in the red zone when time is running out. And then based on like the prompt, we kind of we're looking at the cross hook out as more of our inspiration because it's better for standard field position earlier in the game based on the prompt of being on your own 35-yard line at the first and 10. So then this is looking at kind of optimal route depth versus the Vikings 2-4-5. And you can kind of see a clear cluster between 8 and 14 yards, kind of those intermediate routes. And basically it's showing that the Vikings 2 high shell, it's doing its job. It's eliminating explosives like the deep vertical, but the intermediate seam window is going to remain vulnerable. So we kind of thought the optimal attack is going to be intermediate routes attacking the 8 to 14 yard window, particularly like seams where the tight end can attack gaps vertically and force kind of safety decisions. So to kind of summarize those findings, 12 personnel, balanced formation, intermediate routes, that is going to create confusion with the linebackers and the safeties. And then finally, we kind of looked at, if you go to the next slide. Sorry, the Bills specific personnel, which personnel are going to be the most effective. So here we actually took data from an NFL FastStar data set, which has play-by-play variables with specific personnel. So we basically found that the tight ends, Kincaid and Knox, are going to be the most effective against the 2 high where it's a light box. And it kind of, so this really reinforces our decision to use the 12 personnel that has those 2 tight ends. And then here we just, as more reinforcement, we found that the intermediate window is going to be the sweet spot for Kincaid and Knox specifically. That's where they're going to generate their best EPA. The receivers are a lot less efficient there. So it's really emphasizing that against 2 high, the intermediate stress is coming from the tight ends and not the slot. And that's what we wanted to highlight in our final game design. So yeah, this is the final kind of game play that we drew up. So going from left to right, the left wide receiver is going to be running a curl route at 10 yards. This is going to attack the soft spot where the outside linebacker is going to have to choose between the curl and the seam. If the Mike linebacker commits inside, then the curl has space. It's going to be the secondary read. We wanted the primary read to be those tight ends. So moving on to the tight end Y, this is going to be the primary read. It's probably going to be Kincaid or Knox. And basically the vertical attack is going to force the safeties to make decisions between the seam and the post route. It works in cover 2 and cover 4. Linebackers are going to struggle with athletic tight ends in space, and that's exactly what we have with the Bills personnel. So that's what we wanted to emphasize. And then the right tight end, marked H, is going to be running a post route at about 15 yards. This is really good at exploiting cover 4. If the defense rotates their safeties to the center, then there's a massive middle opening from hash to hash. And again, the post routes are going to be good with athletic tight ends like Kincaid and Knox. Yeah, and then the wide receiver, Z, is going to be running a slant route, and that's, again, creating the horizontal movement that looks like a screen initially, but then it's going to help having a horizontal attack if the verticals are locked down. It's also quick timing, which helps against aggressive coverage underneath. And then finally, we have kind Cook, the running back in the backfield, and he's going to be running a wheel route, which the Bills are very effective at using. And this is kind of going to provide that emergency outlet if the coverage locks down everything else. It's a high completion rate, about 76%. And it's going to just act as like the safety valve. So basically, in summary, the power of this play isn't each route like individually in their individual EPA, but rather the combination of the routes that's going to force, with the multiple vertical threats with the seam and the post, it's going to stretch the safeties, force them to choose. The intermediate routes of the curl and the slant are going to occupy the zone gaps. And then finally, the check down, which is the wheel route, is going to provide that safety option. And this was kind of the summary of all of our findings based on the data that we thought would be the most optimal. Thank you so much.
Judges are now free to ask questions.
Yeah, really good stuff, guys. Really enjoyed all the visuals and the presentation itself. So really good job there. The question I have is kind of from a data perspective. What were some, as you were working through this project, were there any additional data points, anything specific that you guys had in mind that you guys think would even enhance your research or enhance your analysis even further?
Yeah, I can take this one. Unfortunately, we didn't really have time to look at plays. But what happened in the data set is under coverage type, when it was a run, we just had null for the data. So we were going to run a regression to try to determine if a run play had, the too high look beforehand. And we were going to try to see how and when running the ball would be most effective with the too high look in mind. Be like a next.
Yeah, that's all I had. But yeah, great job, guys.
All right. Anyone, if any judges have any extra questions, now's your time. Otherwise, you guys are free to go in terms of Dartmouth team. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, guys.